Hey everyone. My name is Ochumare. I am the youth program officer for New Haven Pride Center. And thank you so much for joining us in this panel titled The Realities of LGBTQIA plus Homelessness. Eliot?
Hi. I am the trans, intersex, and non-binary program officer at New Haven Pride Center. I am excited to bring to you today our panel on LGBTQ homelessness and specifically trans and queer youth homelessness. I use he, him, his pronouns. Before we begin today's program, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the land on which we are hosting this event. The New Haven Pride Center was founded and operates on the traditional lands of the Mohegan, Mashantucket, Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Shagatikok, Golden Hill, Pascaset, Neontic, and Quinnipiac peoples. We hope that from wherever you are, you take a moment to acknowledge and honor the Native people whose lands you occupy and the history of the place you are in. If you want to find out more about Native lands, you can go to native-land.ca and find out some more information. So to keep going, in a continuation of our ongoing series talking about homelessness, we previously discussed in our community conversations homelessness in the community and how it disproportionately affects the queer and trans community, and that's further compounded by lived experiences such as immigration status, BIPOC visibility, whether or not you pass. It can just get very messy. So here with our panelists, who have either have had direct experience with homelessness or have served in a support capacity within the community. We hope to talk to them and investigate the realities that the queer and trans community live in, specifically in Connecticut, and the resources that are available, considering the strained resources of the state and the city already, especially during COVID. So finally, before we begin, I would also like to take a moment to thank Chris and Simone for coordinating our ASL interpretation and all of the amazing interpreters that we work with to make our programming more broadly accessible. So now let me introduce our panelists. With us today are Andy and Elisio. We have one more panelist that might be joining us later. So I will let them introduce themselves now, if y'all want to go ahead.
Sure, I'll go first. My name is Elisio. He, him, his pronouns. I work as a hotline operator with Translifeline.
Hi, I am Andy Stowers. Anthony is also a fine name to use. I use the pronouns they, them, or he, him. It looks like I wrote that wrong on my name. Apologies. So I used to live in Connecticut. Right now I live in Tallahassee, Florida. So for those of you who are not familiar with the history of Tallahassee, Florida, this is the ancestral land of the Seminole, Muscogee, Creek, Miccosukee, and Appalachee tribes. So these are the tribes that are the ancestral caretakers of this land. So what I do here is I am in a doctoral program studying political science and specifically authoritarianism, and I teach topics related to discrimination.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And before we dive into our questions in this discussion, we want to also thank our sponsors, CT Humanities, and everyone that is joining us on Facebook and social media. Take a second to share our discussion before we go live. If you have any questions, right down there. Make sure that you share them on Facebook. We will make sure to try to our best to share your questions and comments that are coming from social media. And again, thank you so much for joining this conversation. It is going to be very informative. Eliot?
Yeah. So just to start off, in the UCLA School of Law, a study on LGBTQ homelessness in the U.S., released in May of 2020, was kind of this study is the first to provide an estimate of the proportion of sexual and gender minority peoples in the United States experiencing homelessness compared to cis straight people. Kind of using a representative national sample. So something that was particularly jarring, according to the study, was that the majority, 71%, like crazy, experienced homelessness as an adult, 18 and up basically, and 20% experienced homelessness before the age of 18, and 9% reported homelessness experiences in both youth and adulthood. So, I guess the first question I really want to ask is, what are some of the things that you have seen in your work and lived experience that have contributed to some of these kinds of statistics that we're seeing? Like, why is the queer community disproportionately affected so much by this? And anybody can jump in.
So I think that one reason is we really have one standard narrative of how we conceptualize homelessness. And we really think of this as somebody who is living outside or maybe staying in a shelter who does not have access to any kind of housing. But that's actually not really how homelessness is typically defined. So there may be people who are living with relatives or friends or couch surfing, and they may also be designated as homeless. So the biggest thing that I have seen come up as a problem related to stigma and discrimination is that there are some regulatory barriers. So when I changed my name, it was actually the case that for about a year and a half, I think, I couldn't really document who I was to potential landlords. So the way that I was accessing housing was primarily by relying on other people who actually did have the lease or who owned the house. And I saw that Lucas asked about the study. It's the UCLA School of Law. I believe the Williams Institute is the research house that did that study.
Thank you for answering that. I wasn't particularly sure about which one, and so I appreciate the info.
Also share more about that study as we go along. I really was into that thing, really studying it, picking it apart. So we're going to share information, particularly from that study, throughout the panel, and we'll be sure to make sure that the New Haven Pride Center shares that link online so folks can go directly to the study and start to interact. Elisio, did you want to answer that question?
Sure. Yeah. I think a big reason why why that's such an issue. Not defining that. It kind of well, just in general, I feel like a big reason why there is so much homelessness is because LGBT persons are often seen as kind of like other people, not quite like regular people, not quite human, and it's so degrading, and it just puts people in this mindset that they don't either deserve any better than what they have, and so they just like sometimes don't even feel like they have the opportunity or the voice to advocate for themselves and to really like better their situation, if that even is an opportunity for them.
Yeah, actually, so what I heard was that there's only one standard narrative, which is actually very, very much in a kinship to every point of social justice work that I participate in myself and then also have seen. there's always one narrative, and I will say that that's also a point of genocide. When you're trying to erase folks, that is one of the ways that folks who are oppressors, unfortunately, sometimes we could be that, to manipulate the folks around, especially the folks who are not of that lived experience, but also we see that matriculating into us who are queer. And we also, like Elisio said, we also begin to believe that we don't deserve better, because all the narratives are so oriented in one way. According to the same institute, and again, thank you, Andy, for sharing that, the Williams Institute also found that 40% of the homeless youth served by agencies identify as LGBTQIA+. 43% of those same clients served by drop-in centers also identify as queer or LGBTQIA. 30% of street outreach clients identify as LGBTQIA. And 30% of clients utilizing housing programs identify as LGBTQIA. And and so I would love for us to talk about the role that we see stigma and discrimination play into renting and house sales of houses, and also let's expand that a little bit and talk about mortgage lending. Because as we know, even folks can have enough money, especially with the economy that we're in and all these first-time homeowner programs, that if you are lower to lower income and you have a sustainable income, there are pathways for folks to secure their own property. So what do we see that you folks specifically see in your work that play into the stigma and discrimination?
So, with respect to specifically your comment on something like lending, that so with respect to the housing issues, first of all, I think it's really common that we see LGBTQ plus people who are having housing access issues, because let's think about what are oftentimes straight people experiencing when they are looking for housing. Oftentimes straight people are able to rely on family connections and are able to get people who they know or who they've been friends with their whole lives to help, but that may not be something that is accessible to LGBTQ people who oftentimes are rejected by family. And then on the mortgage note, something that's really interesting is I actually have to bring way more than the legally required amount of documentation if I have to have any kind of credit check at all. Because if I have my credit checked, it turns up an error because there are two names associated with my social security number. This doesn't happen the same way to people who have gotten married and changed their name, to my knowledge. But what that can do is it can and has turn up what looks like an error. So it makes it appear as if I'm a sketchy person, even if I have done everything correctly. And so I actually am not sure what this looks like for trans people generally, because I don't know any trans people who own their own house. I know a lot of trans people who rent. I know a lot of trans people who are like later into their 20s who have relatives who like actually have been really helpful and who have allowed them to stay with them, but there are barriers to accessing housing for trans people in that respect. Also, everything that I'm seeing about like the comment about arresting people for being homeless, yeah, like this is a thing that is especially harmful to trans people who often don't experience the same kind of protections within the legal system, particularly if they are BIPOC.
Yeah, I think you touched on a lot of really important things there, and just like the extra steps and extra loops that trans people and LGBT people need to jump through in order to, find housing, whether that's just like, the credit thing that you brought up or any kind of name affiliation, changing names, and whether that has even changed. And, like in theory, it makes sense, like the legality of using like a legal name, but like it's just so it's not right because now somebody needs to like detonate themselves in order to have a place to stay.
Yeah, and I think a thing that people don't realize, and like maybe you've experienced this too, is sometimes I've given somebody my ID that had the wrong name in trying to access housing. And it was at a point in my transition where like I looked quite masculine to people, but I looked very feminine in my ID, and they would think that I was giving them fake ID. So I don't know if others have experienced this too, but for trans folks specifically, oh my gosh.
I think I'll jump in right there. And like, beyond homelessness, all the different things, there could be a whole different panel about the problems with IDs, specific to trans people, and like, let alone credit, housing, just trying to open a bank account. Like, it gets crazy. But yeah, I don't want to focus too much on that right now, but I hear that most definitely.
Well, one second, I kind of do want to just explore that a little bit because I was hoping that folks would mention things like IDs and the preliminary identifying things that folks need to be able to access the services for folks who are poor. I know I'm queer. I have been poor since since I've had to take care of my own self as an adult. And one thing I can say as a Black person trying to secure those things like IDs and being homeless, I've experienced homeless at two different points in my adulthood. Trying to losing an ID and every information, every piece of paper that would say who you are as a cis het person, and then not having a piece of mail once you actually get the money to go and get all these things again for the things like birth certificates and IDs that actually cost money. Not having a mailing address to put down in order to be able to receive these things. There were several points that I was making enough money to apply for some of these housing programs that would have allowed me to own a house within 3 to 5 years. Unfortunately, during that whole time, I was so roundabout and didn't have all my things in one place that as soon as I started to make a little bit more money and actually able to afford my own apartment, I no longer qualified for those same programs. And so some of the things I noticed as someone who also works with, also used to work very closely with homeless youth, and specifically in the age demographic of 18 to 25, that was the story. We used to commiserate so much when I was at work with these same young people that what I was saying was their story as well. And so there's often times and points where folks can secure some kind of program like that financially. Finally, they're just not poor enough, but they're still poor enough to be able to access those services. But there are still so many gateways that they have to enter to be able to get that oftentimes when we just do it ourselves or try to do it ourselves and save, we're no longer able to apply for those services. So that is another hiccup I see, that unfortunately all folks that are homeless are facing, that line of not being under the poverty line and being at the poverty line. And so our next question kind of leads into the folks who are not yet able to save up enough money for those home programs, right? And they're still on the streets homeless or couch surfing, which, to your point, Andy, a lot of queer folks, when I was homeless, I did a lot of couch surfing. I found family that were like, oh, hey, we heard, but we couldn't find you. And thank you for reaching out. Because I was like, yeah, I got a kid. I can't sleep outside anymore. So can you help me? What roles and of stigma and discrimination do we see for queer folks that play into the culture and policies of shelters and transitional housing programs in the state of Connecticut or wherever you are?
I think, Elisio, if you want to go first, you probably know more about this in the Connecticut context than I do.
Sure. I'm honestly not too aware of Connecticut specifically. But the first thing that comes to mind is, uh, I don't want to delve too far into politics, but when, Trump did that thing where he was like, uh, allowed people to discriminate, against trans people trying to get into shelters and just basically like finding ways to like clog trans people by their appearance and everything like that. And I think that that's a really big reality in in trans folks trying to find shelter. Just brings to mind people who are calling on the line looking for shelters. It's really important that we're finding shelters for them that are LGBT friendly, because a lot of shelters, I should say, are associated with different, religious organizations. That can be like a very dangerous place for trans people. It's a very sad reality to have somebody calling, begging for help, and not being able to find something, because every single organization, every single shelter, everything that you find is not suitable for them, because it has to do with a religious organization, or it doesn't specify that it's LGBT friendly, and it just limits what these people have access to. It's not even something. They're not looking for anything above and beyond. They're literally just looking for shelter, a basic necessity that everyone shouldn't have to fight for. And it's just another thing that's making it harder for them to transition, harder to see themselves as valuable. Just really,
I want to jump in here, too, and kind of in two different points. The first, we're talking about shelters, and we've also talked about couch surfing. And I think it's really important for people to understand that homelessness is a wide breadth of experience. It can take on so many different forms. Whether you're on top of a vent, you're sleeping in your car, you're sleeping on your friend's couch. Like these are all different kinds of houselessness. There isn't one narrative. So I think it's important to recognize that. And also, as we're talking about how discrimination plays a role in shelters, I think it's also important to note that, a shelter might be fine. A shelter might be totally cool, not or religiously affiliated or not, but the worry and the fear can not stem necessarily from policies in that shelter, but the demographic and like other people in the shelter. And I know this is a problem at warming centers as well in Connecticut, because even if the place is fine with you, that doesn't mean everyone else who was there with you is going to be fine with you. And like, if I'm a trans person who doesn't pass, or if I'm visibly queer, or if I'm some mix of something, like, you're going to take issue with me, and I'm not really going to I'm just looking for a corner where you're going to leave me alone. And that's kind of the opposite. So even, this discrimination can pop up not at the shelter level specifically in its management, but just from the shelter itself as a congregation place. But I just wanted to point that out as well, because I've heard a lot of people talk about that before. And it's personally one of the reasons that I never felt comfortable going to shelters.
I actually used to work in a shelter in Connecticut. And it was actually one of the, and please notice my air quotation, one of the safe shelters for trans folks. And the reason why I have it in air quotation is that on paper, it actually was very, very much safe for trans and queer folks. However, as the only queer person that was on staff and the only Black queer person, I want to specify that. Sorry, because that's important. I was the only one to advocate when folks that were also living at the shelter were very verbally or violent or threatening to be physically violent. And if the staff also feels how the folks that are behaving in that way feel, they'll very much kind of just never hear anything. And it was a very small shelter, but I found it my queer protector bubble to always try to be in the family spaces when we were having those times, so that the person could see, because I'm not trans, but I'm verbally very queer. I always talk about my queerness and blackness, and you will see at least one pride flag somewhere in the vicinity of where I am, or like I'm gay and so what, I'm better than you, like shirt or something. So you can pretty much, and I'm like, I'm getting married, I'm always dating women, and I'm very vocal about that. So I don't feel like I need to be like, hey, you have this safe space here, but just the conversations that I would talk about and the work that I would do, I was very alone and siloed in that work. And so the policy, the unspoken policy, and that's why I also said culture, because yes, we don't want to get too much into politics, but our lived experiences as queer and trans people, where our bodies have been politicized, whether we want to be politicized or not. And so a true power that I found for myself is owning that my body is politicized in the ways that it is, and being able, so that I'm able to pivot and thwart oppression when I'm not seeing, when I normally wouldn't see because I'm unaware. Eliot, do you want to go to the next question? Or actually, Andy, did you want to share? I'm sorry.
I just wanted to add a quick thing on shelters. I keep bringing up regulatory stuff, but those are the things that I really know about this. So it's, if you are interested in finding housing in a shelter, that's not an automatic thing, right? So many places there's an application process. If you do not have an ID that can prove who you are, that's not going to work. And so even if you are not a trans person, even if you're queer, perhaps you don't have contact with your relatives and you can't get access to the kinds of documentation that you would need to fill out this kind of application. So there can be all other kinds of mediating factors in even getting into a shelter in the first place. And then I think an important thing to note here is, while Connecticut does have protections for housing discrimination, that doesn't necessarily mean a lot, because if you have something that there's very high demand for, the people who are making the decisions about who gets to be in the shelter are like, I mean, potentially, if this is a very overcrowded situation and you're having some kind of documentation issues, or you're being difficult in any way, or they think you might be difficult with the people who are working there, if they're not especially queer friendly, you might be out of luck there. Even if everything else has been done right, and even if you have nominal protection under the law, there really may be no incentive for people you're dealing with to be especially helpful to you.
I think that actually really nicely leads us into our next question, which is talking about the Fair Housing Act and the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. So we have both of those, and neither of these statutes expressly like enumerate sexual orientation or gender identity as a prohibited ground for discrimination. They both forbid sex discrimination. So it's 2021, literally, and you know, again, not to get political, and I still can't kind of get over it. I know. But Biden said the word trans, and like I don't really care about Biden more than the fact that thank God Trump is gone. But that, you know, we're at a time where that word can be said out loud by the most powerful person and public figure in America. And, you know, it doesn't rain down on him. That's amazing to me. So, right, why do you think in 2021 we still don't have better protections for queer folks in place? Like, the president is talking about us, there has to be something. And this might be going over what we already talked about, but I think it's important to bring up, specifically with the Fair Housing Act and the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, that we are not part of that category.
So, I mean, I guess I'm very skeptical that we should have the expectation of fair housing for queer and trans folks when we still do not have like an end to redlining and housing discrimination for people of color. And I do think that that kind of thing is actually pretty connected to the way that we discriminate against trans people now, because historically, they're actually it was kind of known that sometimes people were just trans, and that was not something that was especially harshly criminalized in law until after we started seeing more rights being brought out for Black folks in the United States. And so, actually, if you look back historically, the first people who were criminalized for being trans were people who had been freed from enslavement and who were functionally, at that point, being punished for not adequately conforming to white supremacist culture. So I think that obviously, like that seems pretty distal from what we're talking about, but actually, in terms of housing, I think that we don't have adequate protection for trans people because we haven't dealt with any of the ways in which white supremacy is enforced as a discriminatory factor that is really attempting to segregate the non-desirable portions of the population. And to be very clear, I do know that this is something that affects BIPOC folks the most strongly, particularly people who are Black women of color or Indigenous women of color. It is something that I think the wider trans community should be aware of, and be aware that being invested in anti-racism housing is part of pro-trans and pro-queer housing as well.
Elisio, did you want to comment on that too, maybe?
Yeah, so I think that this kind of goes back to at the beginning what I was saying about trans folks and LGBT folks in general just being seen as others, and it just brings to mind how there's a few different reactions to in general people finding something new. I'm sure that a lot of us when we were kids in grade school and somebody had braces, they were teased, at least in my age group. And so it's just like these new things, people either tease it and they think it's weird, or they think that, it scares them. Neither reaction is good, but I think that education plays a really huge part in this, where if people were truly educated on what it means to be trans, on the real experiences of trans individuals, and we just humanize that, that would go a long way. Because the things that trans folks are experiencing right now, I don't think anyone would truly want for anyone. And the fact that somebody is trans should have no, deciding factor on whether somebody has a place to sleep, whether they are, going to face police brutality, whether they're going to be criminalized for whatever reason.
Yeah, I got to clap for Andy because I needed, that was everything. Something that I've been finding in my work as an organizer in the various social justice work that I do is I'm doing a lot of historical research of how laws that are currently, especially in Connecticut, for some laws are like 200 to 150 years behind. Or what we've done was just created a new regulation instead of taking out something and putting in something new. And so as far as like the Fair Housing Act and the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, we see exactly what Andy is saying. Since the beginning and inception of everything in America, itself, we have always watched the othering of folks, and the othering of folks is what allows the creation of per capita, which allows some people to be the workers and some folks to be the recipient of those workers' work. And what we see is the way that this country has been written. It was written as if trans folks never existed, or that queer folks never existed. And then when we do, as further back we go, we see that any answering or sharing of those lived experiences are always demonized or dehumanized until very recently, where we have queer historians and folks who have an intentionality about doing that work, going back and rewriting and telling the real actual history of our queer history, which is very Black, very brown, and very indigenous. And what I think is the number one reason why we don't have any better policies for queer folks, especially for trans folks, is that the majority of queer cishet white folks, especially men, still subscribe to patriarchy, capitalism, and racism. And until those very, very strong diseases are worked out in our community as a collective, there's marginalization in a community. There's only going to be certain folks who get to win. Like if we talk about gaining the ability to marry, that was pushed by cishet white queer people, and it left out so many people who started this movement. If we look at the whitewashing of Stonewall and just things that are the foundation of our queer organizing and social justice history have been very much whitewashed, and we see that happening still. And what was that? The last Stonewall movie was made with the white guy in like 2018. Andy?
So what you were saying, particularly about like how structural oppression is enforced, I think if we look at the historical development of even citizenship or voting rights, those things were very tied to owning your own house. And I think today we see that as kind of one of the pinnacles of economic success is I own my own land, I own my own house. So I actually think that in a very real way, that is something that a lot of people in power kind of think is a reward that must be earned. And it's something that I think queer folks and just people who generally are not as interested in I'm trying to not be too spicy here, but just people who are not interested in conforming to white supremacist standards of how they should live their lives are like disproportionately barred from access to housing because we view having safe housing as like something that you must earn by being a productive member of society as we define it. And this has historically been enforced in law.
Yeah. Eliot, I thought I saw you about to unmute, or no?
I mean,
was I forcing you? I'm sorry, I forced you. I'm a bully.
No, oh my God, no. I mean, like, until you want to be, but...
See, you know me. Life. I want to, if we're okay to move on, though, then I would like to bring a question that I kind of developed while we were talking and also from Facebook, is the question of police brutality and applying for housing programs for HUD housing. I don't know, and for federal housing that is funded federally. So if we look at some of the restrictions, you can't have a certain kind of background. If you are trying to get into federal housing, you can't have a medical marijuana card. You cannot own a legal gun. And so for a lot of queer people, when I was working with trying to do the transitional housing programs where, we help you by paying your security deposit, and we help you get into this program that, they pay half, you pay half for a year, and then you whittle down to you're paying 100% of your rent. However, with the legalization of marijuana in Connecticut and how it's only medicinally used, a lot of queer folks specifically, but a lot of folks who are experiencing PTSD, extreme pain due to chronic illness, who are finally deciding to not subscribe to prescription medication and treating themselves alternatively are now not able to acquire public funded housing. And so if we add that to the folks who are homeless and have been arrested 10 times because they're living downtown, or so now they have a history of vagrancy, and depending on what city you're in, how bored the police and the judges are in that area, you can get very much penalized to the point where you are unable to secure federal housing. And those acts are also police brutality. Let's not, cover that up at all. Yes, Carly, housing is a human right. And so I would like to touch on the ways that we see, and I use that example to share that police brutality is not always the physical direct act of police beating or murdering a person, but it's also the other ways of gatekeeping that are verbally violent and emotionally violent, so much so that can trigger PTSD or create a person to have PTSD, which I have seen. So in what ways do y'all folks see police brutality playing a role in the continued forced houselessness of queer folks nationally and in Connecticut as well?
So I have an answer to this. It's a long answer. Right. So this is a story answer, actually. So I was in Connecticut and I ended up moving back to Florida. This is where I'm originally from, and I was able to get back into my graduate program here. Great. So what happened in this situation was that I was experiencing a really awful workplace situation. It was not great. I had an incident where somebody had tried to assault me at work for reasons related to me being trans, and I was not able to access mental health treatment because my IDs didn't match up. So I ended up having to drive to Florida with 12 hours notice in order to access treatment for I had developed PTSD. And so as I was on the way, I booked a hotel. I got to the hotel, and they tried to not let me take my room because I did not match the appearance of the person on my ID card. I got into my room, and they had given me the worst room in the entire place. It had a hole in the floor, and my cat fell through the hole in the floor. Right, it gets worse. I'm trying to get through this quickly, but this is relevant to the answer to your question. So I also had just recently gotten a car, and because of the ID discrepancy, which I was not able to solve, I had to actually go to Florida to get my ID updated so that I could register my car. So the night that I was stuck in this hotel and the cat fell through the floor, this was the last night that my car was drivable legally. I did not have any documentation of who I was. My license was a picture on my phone. I couldn't get it replaced because I was in Connecticut with a Florida ID that didn't match my legal name. My my license plate was expired. So I called the police, and what happened was that the manager said, "I'm not going to do anything about the fact that your cat is underneath my hotel. You should have checked the floor for holes." So I called the police, and the police came, and they did absolutely nothing. They didn't know what to call me. They didn't have any idea how to handle me. And they just said to the manager, "Handle it." And the manager said, "Go underneath the hotel, find your cat." So I ended up underneath a hotel at midnight. And I remember looking at my watch and seeing it's midnight now. It's illegal for me to drive my car, even if I had a license on paper, even if my license on paper had the right name. And so my brother and my mom drove to get me, actually, but I was not allowed to stay at the hotel because I couldn't prove who I was the next morning. They wouldn't let me stay later until my relatives got there. So I had to drive about 150 miles. And the entire time I was driving, I thought, if I get pulled over, like, that's it. I don't get to do anything ever again because I am committing so many different crimes right now. And so I think back on that a lot, actually. And ultimately, I was diagnosed with PTSD. Ultimately, I was able to get on the medical marijuana registry, and it worked so well, and it has helped me enormously. But as I'm in these situations or have been in those situations, I often think, gosh, if this had gone a little bit worse, or if the police had decided to make it a little bit harder for me than they did, which they easily could have, I could have had no ability to get a job for the rest of my life. I could have had trouble getting housing for the rest of my life. And I was very lucky, but there are also a lot of people who have nearly identical situations. Carly says that's called economic violence. Yes, it is. It is the worst. So those are situations trans people are in every day. And I've been extraordinarily fortunate to not be caught by those kinds of things. But I think we have a narrative that trans people are criminal and are socially deviant. And to some extent, it is perhaps accurate that trans people are forced to behave illegally more of the time. But it's because in that situation, I was like, I'm under a hotel. If I call the cops aren't going to do anything. I'm kind of stuck in this situation. There was absolutely nothing I could do to get out of it. And I can recognize that maybe when that narrative is getting spread about trans people, it's because they, like me, had absolutely no other option. So I think maybe that's an illustration of one way that transphobia can show up and can be very shocking to people who were not in the situation.
Yeah, that's wild. Yeah, that I would be like, tell me more, but we're we're gonna close up soon. Before
Well,
we
sorry, can I
oh
add one more thing? Right. So also, I'm saying this as an adult who is usually interpreted as a white Southern man, and that brings like a lot of privilege with it. If there are kids in these situations, man, I have a great relationship with my parents now, but as a kid, I did not know if I would have secure housing if I told them who I was. And so I think there is a layer in here that's like, because I am an adult with the privilege to communicate who I am and have that respected, these things can be less severe. But I think our estimates of youth housing insecurity are probably very low, because there are many children who are in these situations that are maybe not as severe as that story, but are in abusive home situations, or in situations where they don't know what would happen if they came out. And functionally, their housing is insecure, but we can't measure that because they, like me in a lot of these situations, are maybe going to be too ashamed or afraid to let people know what struggles they're dealing with. Sorry, I'm done.
no, don't say sorry for dropping facts, Andy. We're gonna bring you back. I want to share some recommendations that we've gathered, most of them actually from the Williams Institute, but recommendations that I've been carrying around homelessness and LGBTQ folks. So one is adopt a comprehensive federal and state protections against sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination. Evaluate the extent to which LGBTQIA plus people face barriers to accessing programs and services aimed at increasing housing affordability and reducing housing instability, and take corrective actions as necessary. Expand housing and shelter options for queer folks so that they are sheltered safely and appropriately, and increase the number of LGBTQIA plus affirming agencies. Mandate training for all staff at agencies providing housing, child welfare, homelessness, and any other relevant services to the queer community in order to ensure that staff become and remain equipped to serve queer people. And lastly, enhance quantitative and qualitative research on housing and homelessness among LGBTQIA plus people and subpopulations, such as transgender folks, people of color, Black folks, and those in particular regions or states. Thank you so much. I'm going to throw it to you, Eliot.
I know we're in our last 8 minutes here. What can be done to help parents who are so out of touch with their children? Leon, you're gonna be right, one. But I think that is important to answer now, actually, specifically for Connecticut, because queer and trans youth in Connecticut are a particular crossroads when it comes to resource. as some very well-known ones are going out, and some. Oh, sorry. But yeah, I guess to answer that question real quick, my own perspective, I think having these difficult kind of conversations is the first to doing that. Happens in silence. Silent, you're complicit. There's kind of no excuse, and you know, if you're okay with that complicity, more power to you, I suppose, but you have to understand that that's the consequence of the silence. So if you do want to start the kind of conversation, reaching out to places like the New Haven Pride Center or wherever you are, whatever sources are available, whether it be a Pride Center, and also since this is the digital age and we're in COVID, there are so many resources online. Just in finding the right kind of language that might be helpful, and you know, starting these conversations. Here are some people or organizations doing work on LGBTQ housing access in Connecticut and nationally. I'll read them out in case people. Oh no, I won't. And
I can read them out for you if you want me to.
Yeah, I think we can fit it in. We got 6 months.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so Safe Harbor Project. Y2Y, the letter Y, the number 2, and the letter Y. Youth Continuum. The Urban Institute. CT Coalition to End Homelessness. National Alliance on Mental Illness. 211 Connecticut. UCLA Williams Institute, and Department of Housing and Urban Development. And I'd also say, please reach out to Trans Lifeline, as well as the New Haven Pride Center. And we will try our best to support any folks, whether you are facing homelessness. We have a clothing panel, affirming clothing closet at the Pride Center. We are able to support you with finding resources to feed yourselves. We have case management. JC is our amazing case manager. And whether you speak English or Spanish and you need someone to talk to, JC is the person. You can reach out to myself, Eliot, or Patrick, and you make sure that you use that link right there, newhavenpridecenter.org, and let us know what you need. I also want to share to Leon that you can also use some of those resources that we shared with you. And I would encourage everyone to reach out to the Pride Center. We are always securing new resources to make sure that we are able to point folks in the right direction. And if we need to create a thing, we'll create a thing. So reach out to us. Thank you so much for joining us. I would like our panelists to ask if you have any final comments, letting folks know how they can reach out to you, sharing your links for Trans Lifeline again. And I'm going to throw it to you.
Yeah, I actually had something to say about the parents of LGBT youth. There are some discussion groups and support groups for parents of trans individuals or, you know, LGBT family members, and I think that that would be a good space for people to get some insights and education. You know, I personally don't speak to my parents, but when I do open that up again, I do plan on going to one of those discussion groups with them in order for them to kind of have a better understanding of my experience, and just in hopes that they could be a little bit more sensitive to some of the issues that we talked about.
Oh, sorry. I realized I have not been doing.
No, I was gonna bully you and say, Andy, make sure you go.
Great. Yeah. So similarly, I had a couple of thoughts on the parent stuff. So I do talk to my parents. I think my mom is actually watching this. But what was really tough for me to understand about my parents' perspective, and I say that with like, I do not think it is always healthy to try to see things from a parent's perspective. I totally don't. In my case, that was a healthy thing to do. And I was able to understand that from the perspective of my parents, it was like the person that they had had all these hopes and dreams for had died. And I obviously had to wait till I was at the point where I could engage with their pain. Like basically, I kind of say I had to wait until I could let it be about them for a little bit, and then that was the only way we were going to get through it. But like, I kind of came to understand that on some level, my parents really felt like they had failed me, and that was really difficult to come to terms with because at no point did I think like what is going through their minds. And so I think it is not always the case, but it can be productive with parents to just be like, I mean, why are you upset about this? Do you feel like it says something bad about you? Do you feel like it says something bad about how you raise your kid? There's nothing wrong with your kid. Like, they probably would just rather you got over it. So they're not going to be upset if you just get over it. I think that kind of, if you have the emotional space and if it's the appropriate thing, which it is not always, it can be really productive to just like try to engage with their pain, especially if I'm talking to someone else's parents, not as much with my own, that can be harder. But like, I think being able to acknowledge like, hey, I know that you might feel like you failed, but you know you didn't, right? Like, I think that can do a lot of work that is surprising. Obviously depends. Lots of caveats here.
Well, thank you so much. And Andy, you've given me my idea for my next panel. So thank you so much. And I will be reaching out to you to make sure that you sit on that panel so we can talk to parents. I'm getting this question a lot, especially with the current climate of Connecticut and things shutting down and stuff like that due to COVID. So this is actually the perfect time. So thank you so much for that, Andy. Thank you so much to everyone that has joined us. We have a couple more minutes. Eliot, did you have anything that you wanted to share?
I kind of just wanted to thank everybody for coming, and Andy and Elisio for kind of joining the conversation. Yeah, thank you again for joining us for today's program. Remember, the center is here for you year-round with dynamic programming, support services, case management. I mean, you've heard us talk about it. You can find out more about this at newhavenpridecenter.org in the doobly-doo below. If there's any Vlog Brothers fans out there. Don't forget to follow our social media, including at New Haven Pride Center on Facebook, at New Haven Pride Center on Instagram, and at New Haven Pride on Twitter. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel, which is just youtube.com/c/New Haven Pride Center. Finally, if you enjoyed today's program, please consider joining as a member. It is free. Everyone loves free things. At newhavenpridecenter.org/join now. You can also make a donation to support our programming at newhavenpridecenter.org/donate. We at the center are a nonprofit. We rely on our members, on the people in our community to help us. We do this for you, and anything you can contribute is amazing.
And thank you to CT Humanities, our sponsor for today.
Thank you. Sorry. And also a quick thank you to our amazing ASL interpreters.
Yes, thank you so much. I know I talked a lot. I know your hands probably tired. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, and have a good rest of your day.
Bye.